Volume 7 C27. Ines found himself enjoying the next few days in the thriving kingdom of Kani. Though he could see that Albedo's eyebrow twitched at being surrounded by so many of what she counted lessers, that was mitigated by her chance to be in Ines' company for hour after hour. I wonder if she's even listening to the guide? Ines asked himself, and tightened his hold just a little. Their arms were linked as they walked, the Wolf Queen and her king themselves acting as guides for the pair, with the former adventuring team, the Swords of Darkness, acting as their bodyguards and walking on either side and at the back of the visiting royal couple. Thanks to your Majesty's aid we've expanded our farmland a dozen times over, and thanks to your provisioning we're able to sustain our population while our harvests grow to compensate. And of course our debt for the weapons and armor that were provided to us will continue to be paid on time. I realize our wooden structures are not exactly grand. Henry waved a hand over toward the crudely made wooden structures, and her husband quickly chimed in. But these are only temporary, placeholders really. As we import stone from the dwarves, we'll put more permanent structures in place. We've budgeted for the next 5 years, and my projects on alchemical production and my personal experiments are finally bearing fruit. I tested my purple potion on some wounded soldiers and it worked perfectly. Your Majesty will be getting those shipments soon. This was an area where Albedo did have some work-related interest, and she perked up at that. So you have actually improved on your magical processes? Yes, Lady Albedo, we've made great strides, but they come in leaps lately. It turns out some of the elves had their own techniques for refining some plants, and by combining their blending methods with ours we are yielding better results than I ever dreamed by ours alone. My grandmother would have loved to see this. He looked away wistfully for a moment, then perked up and added, I doubt we'll be producing red potions anytime soon, but we are making progress, and our wild and growing city will be something even the greatest kingdom will be proud of. Are you sending anyone to the tournament? Ines asked. He spoke a little louder than he normally cared to, but the growing and expanding city was filled with a cacophony of noises from hammers, saws, and other tools. Goblins seemed to make up most of the labor force, but a handful of his lone skeletons could be seen doing some of the work as well, hauling heavy loads back and forth. In addition, some lamias used their natural climbing ability to ferry loads up the taller structures to enable the construction to progress, with scaffolds being more like ladders that stronger races could use to move materials without effort. A number of ogres redoubled those efforts, and as such it was obvious that the boom town of Kani would be rapidly expanding for some time to come. The Swords of Darkness want to go to provide an exhibition and show off your gifts, so they will be going, but in addition, my goblin champion will be going as a competitor. Henry explained. She looked over her shoulder and gave Ines a little smile. I've warned him to be careful, but it seems men of all races simply can't resist a chance to show off their manliness, even if it means taking a drubbing with a stick. She gave Albedo a knowing look, and at that the succubus could only chuckle and cling a little closer to her lord. They are irrepressible, and that is part of why we love them. The matronly voice of the pregnant succubus was rather more gentle than her usually icy tone. When it came to subtle praise of her lord, it seemed she was far more indulgent towards those she might not otherwise have looked twice at except to crush. Days of such tours, dinners, and toasts within the rising palace and within the rapidly expanding heart of the kingdom of Kani were halted only by the arrival of the 3 carriages in the courtyard. The blue and white of the Roblé Holy Kingdom, the blackwood of the Kingdom of Dim Albion, and the gold and red of Riestais slowed to a halt at the newly built palace gates in perfect sync with one another. The bodyguards, human, elven and orcish alike, and their drivers, came to an equally slow halt and never parted from their positions except in the synchronized performance of their duties. The first driver descended from the carriages as the royals and nobles of the Kingdom of Kani and the Kingdom of Nazarick came out to welcome them, and an honor guard of mixed races from elves and goblins to humans and lamias lined the way toward the palace. A new carpet rolled out, pushed by 2 children no more than 8 and clad in fine silk clothing. Their little hands battered and pushed at the carpet until it came to a halt in front of the first carriage. The Holy Queen was the first to emerge, her dainty step falling on the thick red just as the 2 children stood and moved aside so that they were stiffened at the ready with arms at their sides at the right and left of the carpet they just rolled out. Being the hosts, the Wolf King and Wolf Queen took the lead, with Ines and Albedo following at their heels. The Allfather and his mate towered over the hosting monarchs, and so kept steps short to avoid any mishaps. As the Queen stood at the far end and waited, Her driver returned to the top of the carriage and drew his forward to allow the next one to move into place. The orcish driver wore polished armor that glinted in the sunlight rather than simple dress clothes, a reflection of the martial heritage from which he came, though he moved with the same certainty as any servant of royalty. His thick green fingers clasped the handle of the carriage door, and when it opened, the Queen of Frost emerged and descended into the light of day. Her tail lashed a bit at her back, and she was clad in green armor over which was painted a dragon whose claws clutched a series of arrows. At her back a half-tabard hung from about her neck, too narrow to be called a cape. It still fluttered a little in the afternoon breeze. Her talons clicked as she placed her hand over her heart and inclined her head with courtesy toward her approaching hosts. Her carriage, too, moved forward, and then the Queen of Reasties emerged, clad in a broad, crystalline-like gown that might as well have been made of snow for the purity of its whiteness. It caught the light and glinted even more than the pale skin of the Queen of Frost, and the Golden Queen gave a deep curtsy in turn. When the royal couple from the kingdom of Khani came close, the Wolf King spoke. Normally we'd be doing some introductions for ourselves, but I understand that you have a far more important introduction to make, Queen Besserace, so why don't we do that first? Nfur said, and as if he'd rehearsed it, he stood aside to allow the Allfather of Nazarick and his wife to step forward. Kalka felt her heart pound in her breast. Please, please, please don't let this go wrong. Jealousy over lovers was not unheard of, nor was betrayal of a wife in favor of a lover, nor betrayal of a lover in favor of a wife. And it was always possible he would reject their son. He might deny fatherhood, he might have been pressured by the mate he loves. The long-buried fears of the monarch remained buried, coming out only in the faintest tremble as the now white-haired beauty stepped forward. His beloved, she is radiant. Like someone carved by the gods to the vision of perfection. Kalka thought of Albedo, and though her own confidence in her beauty was never lacking, it was at this moment, challenged by the pregnant winged woman at the side of the Allfather. Husband, Kalka said, raising her eyes to meet his rugged features, clad as he was in magnificent black and red robes befitting a monarch. When you were last in my capital, we were husband and wife every night, many times, and for many hours, and when you left to return home after saving my kingdom, you left another blessing behind. She shook her child in her arms just a little, rocking him back and forth. She crouched down and laid her swaddled infant at the feet of the Allfather of Nazarick, then straightened up and hid her fear behind a mask of dignity. I name you as the father of Aurelian. I was with no man before you, I was with no man after you, as my companion, Kelet Custodio, and your own royal guards, can attest. This is your son. This is our son. I swear on my life, he is the true-born son of Ainz Ul Gaon and Kalka Besserace, the true heir to the throne of the Roble Holy Kingdom, and a prince of both my home and the kingdom of Nazarick. Queen Kalka said while putting a hand over her breast. She made a little half-bow, then straightened again to wait for what he might do. Volume 7 C28. The Allfather was briefly stunned to silence when the Roble Holy Queen, his first, lay the infant at his feet. A mop of dark hair on his head, the newborn giggled a bit, its little meaty arms and legs flailed aimlessly, kicking the blue and white swaddling cloth away from his body. The little thing smiled up at him, and its arms stretched out as if aching to be picked up. Yes, of course. The custom. If I don't accept him. The grim and brutal legacy of acceptance, Edine's best guess, was a holdover from before what passed for the modern era, when a fatherless child was almost certainly as good as dead. Still, leaving them to die? Were things so desperate? He asked himself that question, not for the first time, and grimly acknowledged that yes, they must have been. Now, 6 centuries later, his son was laid at his feet to accept or reject, and the mother's eyes darted around pleadingly with a pounding heart between himself and Albedo. Ainz felt every bit of the pressure on him then, more so than before any fight. Sweat sprang to his human flesh and once again he missed his undead body. But doing his best to maintain his dignity, he pushed back the sleeves of his robe, knelt, and scooped up the child in his hands. My son, Aurelian Besserace Ul Gaon, the child and prince of 2 kingdoms. Even though Ainz could not hear the command mantra, but as he raised his son aloft, with tiny kicking legs and a little drool dribbling out the sides of his pinkish baby lips, he could still feel it. And moreover, he saw the effects as the nobles of each kingdom knelt, and heard the effects as the armored knights struck the stone with their armored knees. Every head bowed and every knee bent, and then before Ainz could even consider calling a halt to it, or telling Demiurge to cease, it was over. Demiurge. I should be cross with you for that, but I just can't be. Ainz thought, and watched as the assembly slowly rose to their feet, including the baffled visiting queens. Queen Baraha looks cute when befuddled. It's hard to believe she's regarded as so fearsome looking. He thought in an almost fatherly way, and then he touched his son's face, caressing it with the back of 2 fingers. The boy turned in that direction, revealing an intact rooting reflex. This is more terrifying than the time that raid happened against our guild and I thought we might lose Nazarick. His place is secure, Ainz said, making sure to lock eyes with the Holy Queen. I swear it on my name. Aurelian is my son, and he will be the eldest brother to all my future children, beginning with this one. Ainz promised, and laying Aurelian back in Kalka's waiting arms, he placed a free hand on the belly of the ill mother of Nazarick where his second-born grew and waited to enter the world stage. Kalka closed her eyes, brought the infant up to her face, and nuzzled against him, stopping only long enough to mouth a thank you in return. With the tension gone and confusion fading as each man and woman found their own private excuse for their impulsive act of deference to the young prince, Ainz the Allfather chose to shift to another subject as fast as he could. I was expecting the Draconic Queen to arrive before you. Did you rush to beat her? He cracked a little smile at the trio, and they traded glances at one another before the Frost Queen chose to speak up. Allfather, I traveled all the way here with my royal sister, your wife and son. We didn't hurry at all so as to better enjoy the trip. When we arrived in Riastais at the country estate of Queen Rena, we had to wait almost a day for her arrival. When we left, we took our time in coming here to ensure the Wolf King and Queen, and your esteemed self, had time to relax and prepare. I'm not clear on the true distance between this place and the Draconic Kingdom capital, but even if she left late, she should have arrived some time ago, even accounting for the theocracy's pettiness in mandating a circuitous route. I planned this route myself, Allfather. Queen Rena said with a little frown forming on her face and an unthought glance in the direction of the far-off border that hid her annoyance with her Draconic Kingdom counterpart. It was my intent that she arrive before us, and to make these calculations I recreated the protocols of the Draconic Kingdom's royal routine down to the finest knowable detail. Rena's white-gloved fingers curled into small fists. Even if they had a delay of some sort, my lord, everything they use is modular, intended for quick repair and movement, right down to their carriage wheels. It is unthinkable that the Draconic Queen would arrive late. Rena's body tensed as she felt the outrage of a plan of hers going awry, and even worse for being in the presence of those whom her place on the throne depended upon. This is an outrage. An outrage. She contained the urge to breathe deeply, scream and howl. She suppressed the revealing of her twisted face behind the mask of beautiful innocence, and covered it all by placing her hand on her cheek and tilting her head in that adorable innocent way that made large brutes instantly protective over her. I hope nothing bad has happened to cause their delay. Rena finally said as if it were an impossibility. Something had to have happened. She said in her own private mind, but it caught the eye of the sparkling golden eyes of the ill-mother. An unspoken understanding existed between the two, each obsessed with their own lover in such a way that all things had to be perfect. Wordless discussion could pass in an instant in a single look. You made no mistakes? You are sure? Albedo said with a look. Rena dropped her hand away from her face. Never. This is too important. All 5 queens should have been present. I calculated every route. Rena swore without a word, and to her relief, the succubus didn't seem to doubt her. Then something unforeseeable must have happened. Albedo concluded, and when Rena turned her face to her companions instead, it was as good as acceptance of the demonesque conclusion. Before Rena could speak, Naya's wings popped open with a snap. I can fly faster than a carriage, why don't I fly south and have a look? Even not being a genius on par with Rena or Albedo, the dragonid Queen of Frost could feel tension as if before a battle as surely as she could feel the air brushing her cheek. Still, the impropriety of a queen conducting a personal search made some of the more established nobles give her double takes as if she were mad. But the Wolf Queen was peasant-born and quick to agree. Excellent idea, we can send out riders behind you in case support is needed, Henri said and glanced at her husband. He quickly raised a hand beside his head and curled his fingers toward his palm several times to call for a servant. An armored man clanked over at a light jog, halberd tight in his grip as he approached the assembled royals. Send out 2 companies of wolf riders to the border, Nfoya said, and the guard quickly bowed his head. "At once, sire," he said, and made his retreat. Naya, however, didn't wait. "Then it's settled," she said, and with one brief moment of raw tension, she jumped toward the sky. Her wings caught the air as faces reflexively turned to follow her motion, and seconds later she was soaring out of view. Volume 7 C29. Queen Draudilla knelt beside the woman on the grass within the Elf King's tent. Only 2 days, that's all it took. The woman who lay there was catatonic. Her eyes stared upward at nothing, her mouth open, her breathing labored. Her ribs were bruised, her thighs had large handprints on them, and blood trickled down them. The queen did her best, however. Soaking the cloth in the bucket, she began to gently pat the woman down. "It'll be okay," the queen whispered the lie to her maid. This one, like the others, had kept utterly quiet about Draudillan's true identity, though whether they did so out of loyalty or simply not believing it would matter, she no longer knew. The water splashed into the other empty bucket when the small form of the disguised queen wrung it out in her hands. The water thudded and thumped within, and in a way, Draudillan felt a spike of envy for the woman. She's utterly unaware of what's happening anymore. Not so for the handmaiden that lay grunting and crying under the king not far away. Draudillan did not look over her shoulder to see how the maid was doing. She knew already. The pleading stopped at least, as did the resistance. It meant marginally less pain if they didn't fight back. The queen reached down when she saw the catatonic maid begin to twitch as the cries of her comrade went a little higher and the sound of slapping flesh grew louder with it as the monster of a monarch reached closer to the end. "I'm so sorry, this is all I can do for you," the queen whispered and shut her own eyes, but then set the cloth down and covered the broken woman's ears. It kept the sound out well enough that the twitching seemed to stop. "Gwach." The Elf King grunted, stood, and then using his foot, he shoved the human away so that she rolled like tumbleweed toward the fabric wall of his tent. Slender arms and legs flailed about as if they were part of a mere corpse, until the woman stopped and rolled back onto her belly again. "Clean that one up too, seedling," the Elf King grunted out to Draudillan, who found the will to glare at him with hate-filled eyes that he chose to ignore, or didn't even bother to notice. But the name wasn't lost on Draudillan. She got up and went to the used-up husk of a woman and crouched down at the shoulder. Despite having a child's body at the present, Draudillan retained her greater-than-average strength. So she put the woman's arm over her shoulder and one arm under the woman's chest, and hefted her up, then dragged her around, drooling into the grass, until she could lay the woman beside the one the queen had just been tending to. "Damn him. Damn me. Damn the elves. Damn whomever spawned this monster. At least the beastmen only eat us." The queen cursed in her heart as she took up the wet cloth and began to clean the woman off with the herb-filled water. The foul odor of sex and blood was somewhat diminished by the pungent concoction, a gift of an elf in the king's party. "Use this, the healers will run out of mana, and if you don't want them to die while waiting for the healers to recover, you will need it." The memory of his words were not lost on her, and whether he said them and acted out of pity, or whether he was just hoping to keep the king away from other elves, Draudillan was no longer sure. She no longer wrinkled her nose at any smell, no matter how foul. She simply went about her routine, kneeling between the two maids and wiping down their wounds with the foul water tonic in the hopes of keeping them alive. "I can't protect you. I'm useless. I'm a useless queen. I've failed my every duty." She hung her head and wiped away the foul leaking fluids, struggling to suppress her own tears of rage and the shaking in her hands that would only make her more useless if she gave into it. "My lord, we're ready to go," an elven warrior said, rushing into the tent. "We will cross into the kingdom of Kani soon, and taking the roundabout route if we hurry, we will reach our winter in around 1 month." Draudillan's heart leapt into her throat. "Our winter? The kingdom of Kani? I was supposed to meet the others there, if I can somehow get word to the others." The draconic queen allowed the warmth and light of hope to fill her breast, then it burst like a soap bubble against a spear point. "No, none of them would bother. The Allfather has never met me. He wouldn't know my face unless he saw a coin from my country, and even if he did, why should I expect he'll do anything? Why would any of them? There is no hope. The gods are dead, and there's no chance now." The draconic queen thought, and quietly listened while she resumed her almost hopeless attempt at caring for her broken servants. "Useless trash. Why so long?" the Elf King asked, and the guard, despite being a behemoth in his own right, could only hang his head before his king. "Your Majesty's orders were that we stop daily so you can take liberties with the captured human women, and your majesty refuses to use any of his power to drive us faster." The guard replied. He cast his eyes pityingly toward Draudillan, but before he could utter a single word, the Elf King snarled and stepped. Or that was how the Queen thought of it. One moment he was moving one foot forward, the next he was in front of the warrior, and the warrior's head exploded in a spray of blood, brain, and skull fragments which spattered over the Elf King's naked body, parts of the tent walls, and over Draudillan and her charges, both catatonic and unconscious alike. She shook with a start and suppressed a scream when she felt and saw the spray of a life destroyed in a single blow, and the Elf King lowered his fist. "Useless trash, daring to tell me it's anyone's fault but his own, their own, weakness." The Elf King snarled. "You, seedling!" The golden-haired brute snapped his bloody hand down toward Draudillan and pointing a finger out at her, "Drag the meat outside, then tell the others to get this tent together. I'll use my power to make up for their incompetence this time." The name sent a shiver down Draudillan's spine. "I know what he intends for me when I grow, if he knew what I really was." She nodded with mute submission and scurried to the corpse that fell with a thud, landing in a seated position with its back against the tent. She grabbed his wrists and began to drag him away, backing out to the light of day that at least one elf would never see again. Volume 7 C30. "What do you think you'll see, Anikari?" Layali asked while Brain snored. The white and black-haired half-elf chewed quietly on the smoked fish that her guide made earlier. Campfare at least was not unfamiliar, though doing all this myself sure as hell was. Not bad though, kind of fun, and it beat the boredom. Zess, she thought, until the little girl spoke to her. A few feet away, Brain lay sprawled out with his arms and legs open and sticking out from under his cloak. He scratched his stomach in his sleep, and then Zess, she chose to answer, "I don't know. I just don't." "The truth? Maybe. But I think I'll find something different than what I've always been told. Everybody I've ever known has been keeping things from me, so just whatever they've been keeping back." Zess, she had braved vampires, tentacle monsters, cyclops and demons, but while she stared down every danger without worry or fear, looking at the little half-elf's face was too much. That empty socket where her eye had been. The hopelessness on her face when she saw me. It wasn't pleasant to think about even now. "HMPF," Layali retorted and crossed her legs. "Everything is terrible. Our king sells our people as slaves, or the theocracy takes us as battle captives and makes us slaves, or we're born from a slave's torment or desperation, or there's nothing good out there, Miss Seshi. Nothing. Brain says he'll take me somewhere safe. But that's just a grave." Zess, she frowned. "I don't think he plans on." Layali gave a bitter chuckle, stifling Zesshi's words in her throat. "I don't think he does either. That's the twisted part. He was supposed to get horses for us, he didn't. That means whatever he did to get that healing potion, it wasn't enough, and he didn't buy that much food either. So he spent almost everything he had on him, just to buy me a healing potion. I don't think he'd do that if he wanted me dead. So why?" Zess, she let her words trail off as the little half-elf poked at the dying embers of their afternoon fire with the burnt end of a stick. "When I met him I wanted to die. We kind of had a deal. And he said he's going to kill Cerebrate. I want to live to see that. But when he drops me off somewhere, I won't last 10 minutes when he's out of sight." Layali promised. "Got no family left, got no friends left. Got nowhere to go. No mother to go back to, at least not one who can look after me, and even if he's telling the truth about safe places where we're passing through, what is there for me but more farm work? So why tell me this?" Zess, she asked while the little blue-eyed elf stared hatefully at the dying embers that one by one winked out, their glowing red reduced to dead black remnants or grey and cooling ashes. "Because you don't care if I live or die. Because I want someone to remember for a while at least, even if they don't care. Because I can't tell him." She pointed her stick at the sleeping swordsman. "He's kinda rough, he doesn't say much, and when he does he sounds like he doesn't care about anything, but..." She gave a little half-smile at the snoring blue-haired man. "I don't want to miss anyone, and I don't want more nightmares. There's no future for me awake, and only nightmares when I sleep. Even when Cerebrate is dead, even when the master who sold me is dead, they'll still have me. How am I supposed to be free of all that, especially all by myself again?" Zess, she listened to the small girl's rant. "Is it really that bad, for others like you, I mean? I've never been to a city, but I hear stories from the ones who end up on farms. The elves do the menial work, and the cities have the great farms, the latifundias, huge estates with thousands of slaves working fields for miles around. Or so they say. If those farms work like my home, you'll see a lot more like me and you, Layali said and touched her half-elven ears. Even by Zeshi's standards, the subject was grim, and so she sought a distraction, and instead asked, "How did you survive?" Brain said, "You must have been in that water for days." Layali looked down and dropped the stick. "I dunno. I've just always been kinda tough. One time some of the master's children were throwing rocks at me when they were small. They let me dodge. But I wasn't very good, and I was tired. I got hit in the head a bunch, broke my nose, and some bones. I couldn't work for a long time, but I healed. When I got put out in the field eventually, I got hit a few times. I always healed. I just heal. It just takes time. Like I said, I guess I'm just hardy." She spat into the last of the embers. The hiss of steam came up as the last glowing embers faded to black. "Lucky me," she said, and then looked over to where Brain slept. "I'm going to sleep, okay?" Layali asked, and Zeshi nodded along, unable to think of anything to say at all. Though she watched as the half-elf went to where Brain slept, and slipped under half of his cloak, closing her eyes to the lullaby of his steady snores. Queen Drawdillon wasn't sure what in the world the Elf King was talking about until after he was dressed. That process by itself was almost a degrading parody of attending to royalty. The Queen's own servants attended to her body by dressing and bathing her, but it was a quiet, dignified affair, almost like a dance or a religious ritual. But the elven women who acted as the Elf King's body servants were clad in a mockery of clothing, merely golden cloth near the shade of their skin that hung down at the front and back. He kept them nearly bare, and such was the ease with which they moved, avoiding even a look up at him, that it was clear this was routine. They moved footstools into place on which they stood in order to drape his golden and green robes, and still had to rise to their tiptoes and stretch out their limbs to get clothing onto his shoulders. A true monster in every way. Drawdillon reflected. Her own servants looked at her with either maternal affection if they were older, or adoration if they were younger. Their gazes were pure and certain. They trusted me. Now look at them. Drawdillon all but wept as she watched while other young elven women approached and took up the battered human captives with a surprising degree of familiar gentleness and carried them out of the tent. The women lay in the arms of their bearers as if dead, only the light of life in their eyes still indicating that they were not gone in body even if they were gone in spirit. The looks of the women who attended their king were fearful and anxious. They moved with nervous fingers that paradoxically drew the process out even as they tried to rush it. The reason behind the raid became ever more evident. Trying to spare their own women. It was a very human thing to do, to put the burden on someone else to spare one's own loved ones. It turned her stomach to sympathize with them as she now did, and Drawdillon's hand drifted over her stomach. She pressed her hand there, willing the sick feeling to go away. When it was over, the Elf King pointed at her. "Seedling, get out and get into the cart with my things." "My lord." Queen Drawdillon bobbed at the knees and rushed out while the elves took down the tent. That much at least went quickly, and Drawdillon found that the cart she was to climb into was a little too high off the ground for her small body. A hand stretched out to her. It was that of an elven woman. "Come on, climb up," she said while Drawdillon looked up with a little frown on her face. "Do you want him to see that you're not in when he comes out?" the elf asked, and Drawdillon thrust her hand up to accept the offered help. The elf woman pulled and Drawdillon grabbed the edge with her other hand, put her knee up, and hauled herself into the back. It was a broad cart pulled by 4 slender-looking horses. The cart was made up entirely of women. Some were her fellow humans. They lay silent and unmoving, staring up at the endless sky thinking nobody knew what. Those seated were elves, and they lined what was essential storage chests turned into benches. A few of the women there were showing the first hints of pregnancy, and given the way various elven warriors looked at them, with absolute shame etched on their own faces, and resignation on those of the showing women, paternity was either in doubt, or undoubted for the wrong reason. It only urged the disguised monarch on. She sat on the floor near the closest, and youngest of her servants and drew the woman's head into her lap. "I'm sorry," she said down at the once sunny-faced young woman, who made no response. "Hold my hand, child," the nearest elf woman said, and held her hand out again. The way she said it with such urgency, Draudillan accepted it, and it was then that she saw the lumbering elf king approach his horses. She couldn't hear what he said, but he laid a hand on the rump of each horse in turn and muttered something. Then the horses glowed like white gold in the sun, one by one, and only then did he depart and vanish inside his carriage with one quietly weeping companion letting the door creak closed behind her. What he'd done became evident when the horses and carriages and wagons all lurched forward and began to race at breakneck speed, bouncing over the grass. Their hair was snatched up by the wind and carried high into the air behind them, and what was a breeze became like a gale wind that prevented all conversation for hours before the horses finally began to slow down. When they did, and it was no longer necessary to cling to anyone, the same elven woman said down to her, "Don't worry, child. You won't be of childbearing age for years, you're safe at least until then. And maybe the chance will come for you to escape." The queen looked down at the barely moving husk whose head still lay in her lap. "What about them?" Queen Draudillan asked. "What do you think? They'll have his children until they die. Our king is obsessed with this. We don't know why. But he is. They'll get used to it. They'll survive, whether they want to or not, that's up to them. Some they don't. Just do your best for them, and try to survive as long as you can, child." It was unexpected to the queen, to hear pity from people her theocracy neighbors referred to as enemies of humanity, even the warriors who slew her people and carried her and her servants. "I hate them, but I pity them. Dragged down into the same shit. If I still believed in the gods, I'd be praying for a drink," she thought. But she didn't. Because she had no more beliefs than the emptiness that stared up at the sky and the eyes of the woman in her lap. "How far have we come?" she wondered when the glow of the horses finally faded away and the rattling of their wagons finally became a more gentle rumble. Only one answer came to mind, far enough that it's even less likely we'll be found by anyone who might even consider a rescue.